So we're going to start talking about Latin America since World War II. And before we even get into going through the content, it's important to remember what is the context, what is the geographic context of what we're talking about. And so we need to talk about what Latin America is. And what we've talked about and what we've said time and time again, it is basically the Western Hemisphere, south of the United States. You can see, we've got Mexico, what is called Central America, the Caribbean, you've got Cuba here, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, all the Caribbean islands, and then South America. And so we're going to start off by talking about just general trends in Latin America overall. What are some overall trends in all of these places? And then we'll sort of break it down and go specifically for a few countries. Now, we've talked about a lot of these things already. The rest of the stuff we're going to talk about in this course, a lot of the other countries of the world, they're still, as World War II ends, colonies. Latin America, if you remember, when we talked about the age of imperialism, they were actually gaining independence while these other places are becoming colonies. So they've had independence for a while, it's important to note. But they had a hard time transitioning, particularly their economies. And this is because they were set up to do what the mother countries needed them to do. So they were used to export raw materials and grow cash crops. Well, they were ready to do that when they became independent, and many of them continued to do that. And this helps a little bit, but as it says here, this leads to boom and bust periods, right? So let's say the price of your cash crop, your natural resource, your raw material, let's say the price is high. You're doing really well. We'll talk about Venezuelan oil prices and how when that was good, the government was able to have a lot of popularity because their economy was really good. But then they didn't diversify. They didn't make their economy have enough things going on. They were totally dependent on oil. That when oil prices dropped, we see some of the problems we have in Venezuela today that we'll talk about. And a lot of that has to do with it. But this is a legacy of imperialism. Their economies were not meant to produce things. Their economies were meant to give cash crops and raw materials to the mother country where the stuff would be produced. And that leads in these economies when they're independent to being very unstable and having periods where things go really well, but then not diversifying enough when things are going well, that when that dips, the bottom sort of falls out from their economy. So we'll talk about a few examples of that. Some other things we end up with is this dependence on really foreign control and foreign influence. This happened right after independence, and we get loans from foreign banks and foreign governments, and also dependent upon Europe, the United States, Japan, for technology for them to industrialize, which sort of further indebts them to a lot of these, as it says here, multinational corporations. Foreign debt has been a problem for Latin America through almost all of its independent history. And we see as their economies do poorly, it also leads to living conditions getting worse, unemployment going up, the rate of inflation getting really high in those times where we've got foreign debt, but we've also got their economies and the unemployment rates being very high. And where most of the jobs are in these times is in these cities. And we get what we refer to really as these almost mega cities in some of these countries. We see Mexico City, really the larger area of Mexico City with 21 million people in it. But the population overall in Latin America has tripled in 50 years. And that creates economic problems in and of itself. Social services, urban services, things like, sewers and garbage collection, that kind of stuff is difficult. Supplying enough electricity, clean water. When your population triples in a 50-year period, that's quite a big problem to have as a nation to figure out how to do that. And as we've talked about before, there is wealth in Latin America, but it's concentrated in very few hands. So this gap between the rich and the poor, again, a legacy of imperialism, is difficult because it creates this resentment. It creates sort of almost like a burning anger in the poor in Latin America. And you have this rural and urban poor with hardly enough to survive while we've got a really wealthy minority owning almost all the land. And that had been, again, something that comes out of imperialism. You had these landed elites, these wealthy landowners we had talked about, who control most of the wealth. And then you've got many foreign-owned companies that run most of the businesses, or again, very few businesses that are controlled locally. Those businesses that are controlled locally are controlled by very few people, so that wealth is not evenly distributed either. And again, these are things we'll kind of go into in detail with some individual countries, but that is overall a trend there. And then, of course, we've got U.S. involvement in Latin America, and this has been something we've talked about pretty much every time we've talked about Latin America. In U.S. history classes you talk about the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary and the Good Neighbor Policy. These are all things related to the U.S. involvement in Latin America, and over time, this leads to a resentment toward the U.S. and the U.S. interference. Sometimes it's referred to as the giant shadow over the continent is the United States, this power in the Western Hemisphere that exerts influence and control over these nations. We'll talk about, particularly in the context of the Cold War, where the United States supports governments that are against communism, but maybe are not looking out for the best interests of the people. And this only increases that resentment, where the only reason you support a government, no matter how brutal it might be, is because they are anti-communist. And this creates long-term issues in Latin America in terms of the relationship the United States has with some of these countries. Now, what are the political trends? Well, initially, a lot of military government steps into power, and that's because there was a lot of instability. So sometimes the people sort of look toward the military as a stable force in this chaos after independence, political and economic instability. But then as we get into the 80s and 90s, we see a shift from dictatorship to democracy in most Latin American nations. Now, more recently, there have been some Latin American nations where there is concern about like a backslide into dictatorship, and this certainly seems to be the case in some South American countries where there's a concern that democracy is slowly being eroded in a few of these places. And we'll look at a few of those as we go, but that's sort of being written as we speak in terms of what will happen going forward. But that's an issue that's sort of out there, are some of these nations sliding a little bit into decreased levels of democracy, whereas again the recent trend had been a shift toward greater democracy.